The eve of the induction ceremony, and I'm really excited to bring the 4 original members who are with us out here on stage today. So please, let's give it up for Rod Argent, Colin Blunstone, Hugh, Grundy, and Chris White, the Zombies! Well, I think I'll start off by stealing Susanna Hoff's line from the actual induction ceremony, that it took a long time, but this will be your year, I think, right? It's been pretty amazing.
Absolutely, it's been an incredible experience to be nominated. I think we were nominated 4 times in 5 years, which is incredibly exciting for us. But at the same time, when you're nominated 4 times out of 5 years, you start to think it's never going to happen. And then finally, we were inducted, and we were just so thrilled, And the icing on the cake, of course, was the night at the Barclays Arena in Brooklyn, where we were presented as inductees, and there was a wonderful, wonderful speech from Susanna Hoff as well.
She did a great job.
Brilliant. And we got to play to 17,000 people. Many of them are peers, wonderful musicians and artists right at the front. So no nerves, no problems there. And it was just a wonderful experience. None of us will ever, if that makes sense, none of us will ever forget that night.
Completely agree with you there, Colin. Never forget what a wonderful night it was. To think after all these years that we get to that point was just truly amazing, truly amazing. How wonderful to be here once again tonight with you guys, you wonderful guys.
We love you guys.
Thank you.
Well, it's exciting to have you out here today performing. As Greg said in the introduction, not only 50 years of Woodstock, 50 years since, you guys had the #1 on the charts with Time of the Season. And I think even, Rod, I was looking, it might be about 50 years since you officially started Argent as well. That was around 69 as well, right?
That's absolutely right. And in fact, Chris and I, because...
Chris was songwriting for Argent a bit, right?
Co-producing with Ron, we were writing together.
That's right.
I mean, when the original incarnation of the Zombies split, Chris and I wanted to stay in the business, but Chris said, I want to be a non-playing member now, really. So we immediately found that we had the #1 record in the States, which was a perfect time for the two of us to go over. And I remember we were in Clive Davis's office negotiating a production deal for the first Argent album and also for a solo album by Colin called 1 Year, which is a very lovely album. And I know it wasn't a hit in the States, but in Europe it's a very big album actually, and we had a really big hit single from that album as well, a Denny Lane song called Say You Don't Mind. But I remember while we were in Clive Davis's office, someone came in and said, there's a festival that's being mooted, and it's going to be going on over the weekend in Woodstock. Do you fancy coming? And I said, oh no, I hate festivals. All from London.
So we've got to get back anyway.
And yeah, I wish I could have that day again.
Who knew at the time, right?
Yeah, I don't think anybody did, really.
Yeah.
We needed the mud.
Ironically, we were booked to play at the Woodstock 50 festival.
Tomorrow, right?
I think
You would have been playing.
I know it was around this time, and of course, sadly, it was cancelled. But we were really looking forward to that. And having missed the first one, we waited 50 years. Never mind, we'll be at the next one.
Well, I always like to go back and start a little bit about the beginning, especially having gentlemen like yourself, Hall of Fame inductees here, and think about where you started musically, sort of the background. I know the Zombies begins 1961, and then kind of, officially in '62 more. let's go back a little bit and maybe have each of you talk about some of your musical background. Where you got hooked on music? What, was it something in your house when you were younger? Is it something you had to go out and search and find? I know a few of you in the past, when we've talked, have mentioned Elvis as being someone. So, Chris, maybe we'll start right here with you. What's sort of some of the early musical
Well, the
background?
first thing I remember very clearly is hearing Rock Around the Clock with Bill Haley, and then Elvis, and then Chuck Berry, and all those people that they just affected us. And because we all carry songs from that era, and we associate it with things that happened to us, which is why music is so important, and why young people should keep writing songs, because music is very important. We all need music in our lives, especially at these times.
Absolutely. Was that something in your house? Was there a lot of music around when you were younger at all?
Well, my father played double bass, part-time. He was a grocer most of the time, but I first learned upright bass first of all, but then discovered that a Fender was much easier to carry around.
That's great. Yeah. I got to ask you too, while you're talking about Fender, that Fender that you played even during the inductions, is it the same one that you had back in the day? You recreated the painting on it?
No, my flatmate, Rod, and I shared a flat with Terry Cook, who did the original artwork for Odessey and Oracle, and I was at art college with him, and I asked him to paint the bass, but then I gave it to Jim Rodford, and that got stolen. So then I asked him to repaint it for me.
Wow.
The paint's rubbing off now, it's not that good.
Not as good as the original was, right? How about you? What about your background growing up?
I think mostly it started at school. I remember distinctly, obviously listening to stuff under the pillow on Radio Luxembourg, which used to keep fading. But there was a guy at school, I can't remember his name, but he was always wandering around school singing Elvis Presley songs, which I didn't know what they were at the time. But I kept on listening and thinking, this is great, this is just great. And then before you knew it, I came hooked on that and thought, this is the way forward. But at that point, and I've told the story many times, but I joined we all had to join the cadet corps. The school had a cadet corps, and it meant going up in the woods with guns and stuff like that, which didn't appeal to me at all. But I saw that the band, all they ever did was go down the band hut and seem to clean their kit. So I applied to join. Firstly the bugle, and the neighbours maybe stopped that. And then I took over the drums, or the side drum as it was called then, found I had a bit of a talent for it and thoroughly enjoyed that. It also meant that I was up front in the band when we were marching down in the local town. And I just thought it was quite nice. You got it right, Chris. Pure vanity.
No, the back on stage.
As luck would have it, out of the 4 snare drummers, dear Rod over there said to me one day, "Do you want to join a band?" And immediately I said yes.
Yes.
So that was my influence, and that's where it all started.
Colin, how about you?
Well, only recently I've looked back to when I was really young, sort of 6 and 7 years old, and I've remembered that my mother had 5 brothers, and they all were multi-instrumentalists. So when I was really young, the family was really musical, and some of her sisters, there was a big family, and some of her sisters played music as well, so maybe that has something to do with it. But then really it was just getting into rock and roll, and my parents never had much money, but I managed to convince them to buy a guitar, which was a leap of faith for them. I think my dad was worried it was going to be a 3-day wonder, Here we are, 60 or 70 years on.
Still can't play it.
I know, I'm still trying.
Sorry.
Still trying to learn how to play it. But I had a guitar, and then, like Hugh, at school I was approached. I went to a different school to these guys, but Rod had a mate who lived up the road. It's all chance. This is all chance. Rod had a mate who lived up the road who sat next to me at school because we were in alphabetical order, and his name was Paul Arnold. If we weren't in alphabetical order, I wouldn't have never been in the Zombies. And he said to me, "I've got a mate who's putting a band together. If you've got a guitar," this was my audition, "have you got a guitar?" And I said, yes. And you're in. That was it. That was my introduction to the Zombies.
And of course, because of his brother, Terry Arnold, which was at school with me, and when Paul left, he asked if I was interested in joining. A year and a half later, and that just, again, just was the Arnolds, yes.
And I think, isn't it right that Paul's the one who helped come up with the name The Zombies originally, isn't that right?
It's the original bass player, Paul Arnold, yes. He left because he wanted to be a doctor, and his studies didn't really allow him to rehearse on the weekends. But before he left, he donated that name to us, which everybody loved except me. But a lot of that's down to the fact that I hadn't got a bloody clue what a zombie was. But it was catchy and it just caught on, so we didn't really question it in any depth what a zombie. I don't think we really knew, to be honest. I think Rod had a vague idea. But there was none of that zombie culture that you have now. There were no zombie films, no zombie magazines, so it was a sort of stab in the dark. We were desperate for a name.
We always got a mention whenever the music of that era was talked about, because it was the animals to the zombies. So we always got a mention.
I always hated ZZ Top.
Once again.
I always hated ZZ Top because we were right at the end of the alphabet. We'd always be the zombies, and then ZZ Top came along. Really, it's very thoughtless and insensitive.
What happened with ZZ Top? They became a Zombies tribute band, didn't they? Before they were ZZ Top.
Yeah, when Time of the Season was a hit and there was no band. And so there were 3 bands going out pretending to be the Zombies, and some of ZZ Top, I think it's 2 of them, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was Frank Beard, right? And it might have been Dusty.
They were in a Zombies band, so that's an interesting thought.
One of them apparently changed his name to my name, and took over the bass, which was really...
There's another group, there's another group.
But anyway, good luck to them, good luck to them, that's what I say.
Rod, how about you growing up? I mean, obviously with your keyboard playing too, was there some classical influence in your house or learning piano early on?
Well, we came from, I mean, most of us actually did, but I came from a very working class household, but I had parents who were passionate about music in different ways. I mean, my mum, she was one of 8 kids, all long lived. My mum's just died, aged nearly 101. Wow. She's absolutely amazing, yeah, fantastic. But her sort of music, the music she really liked was really classical music, but the romantic, popular sort of classics, really. And so I'd heard those and really loved what I heard. And my dad, from the age of 17 to the age of 83, had his own dance band. So we had a piano in the house, and he used to play piano. And through him, I sort of got in touch with, I remember particularly Duke Ellington, actually, thinking how great he was, you know, and fantastic. So that was all going on. I did have a flair for music, I have to say. I mean, I don't know how, but I could always, I remember my parents giving me a harmonica when I must have been 6 or 7 years old, and I could immediately see the sort of scale in front of me, in you know, like whole tones and half tones. I don't know quite why, but I always saw it quite visually. So I was really hooked on music, and I loved it. And I'd pick out tunes on the piano and think, I was self-taught, really. But the day, my mum also, she wanted me to join a good choir. So when I was about 9 years old, she said, you should audition for this church choir. So I did, I got in. And then when I was 11, she said, you ought to move on to the cathedral, which had a fantastic choir. And they just happened to have a guy who was 26 years old at that time, I think, who took over being the master of the music there, and he became one of the finest Bach organists in the world, actually. So it was fantastic listening to really 400 years of fantastic classical music. So all that was there and around me, and I sort of, you know, it went in indirectly into me without trying. But I remember the day that I got turned on to rock and roll music. It was in 1956, I was 11 years old, and my cousin, Jim Rodford, who's lately passed away, but was the founder member of Argent with me and was in the Kinks for 18 years on their biggest selling records. He was always a mentor to me because he was 4 years older. And I remember we were always down at his house, which was about 400 yards away from ours. And he played some Bill Haley records, and I was sort of mildly interested. I thought, yeah, I sort of quite like this. And he said, well, have a listen to this. And he picked out a record that he just bought, and he put it on, and it was Hound Dog by Elvis. And it turned my world around. And I always think, for me, that was my first introduction to black music by proxy, because for me, I'd never heard anyone sing like that. And it led me very quickly into listening to people like Big Mama Thornton and the people that did, you know, some of the original rhythm and blues, which, in a sense, was being ripped off at the time, but it was also introducing that whole field of music to a much wider public, which was fantastic. And also, Jim had formed one of the first rock and roll bands in the whole of the south of England, and I went along to see him when I was 11 years old, and I was blown away. And I thought, as soon as I'm old enough, I'm going to form a band. And the result of that was this, you know, finding Hugh in the Army Cadet Corps, playing the drums, trying to impress the girls. I don't think he was trying to impress me, but he was
We don't know.
no. Hugh's private life is his own affair. But, you know, and then on the first rehearsal, we all turned up, and Jim, as always an enabler, always a helper, he drove me to the rehearsal, because I couldn't drive at that time. We were, how old were we? 16, I think, or 15, maybe 15, just 16.
Yeah, wow.
And I knew from Paul Arnold about Colin, so that he was going to bring a mate along. And as we drove up to the meeting place, I said to Jim, "Oh my God, I hope that's not him," because he'd just been playing rugby. He was a really good athlete, actually, and a rugby player when he was young. And he had 2 black eyes and a huge plaster over his face. And, you know, it turned out to be...
my nose.
Broken your nose, yeah. And anyway, so we had our first rehearsal. I was the singer. I wasn't playing the piano at all. And we thought we sounded pretty hot. Jim later said to me and to Colin, he said, "I thought no chance." But we had our first rehearsal, and Jim had loaned us all the Blue Tones gear, which was state of the art at the time gear, and it was just fantastic because we couldn't afford any of that. And during one of the breaks, I went up and to a beaten up old piano, which was about a tone and a half down from concert and out of tune, and I played Nut Rocker, which I had learned by ear, you know, from the record. And Colin came running over to me and said, "Oh man, that's fantastic." He said, "You've got to play piano in the band." I said, No, this is a rock and roll band, you know. It's guitars, isn't it?" And incidentally, that was shared by most early cameramen, because during our early appearances on TV shows, whenever it came to a piano solo or something, they go to Hugh on the drums. So
Cost him a fortune.
That came a little bit later. But then a few minutes later, during a coffee break, Colin picked up this guitar and started picking out a Ricky Nelson tune and started singing it. And I said, "Oh man, you sound great." I said, "I'll tell you what, look, you be the singer, and okay, I'll play the piano." But the thing was, and for the first few, sorry, I'm taking up, we're due on stage in 1 minute.
Good, keep going, Rod.
But the only time you could ever hear me when I was on stage in those days with, you know, acoustic pianos, and they were always out of tune, was when I did a Jerry Lee Lewis Gliss. And I used to do it all night long because I wanted to be heard. You know, so
Right, I mean, that's a keyboard player's trick, right? That's how you get above the guitars, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. And so my thumb would always start bleeding.
And I always used to gauge how well the show had gone by how much blood was coming out. If it was dripping, we did pretty good tonight.
Anyway, I'm sorry, I've been talking for long enough. But I soon after that, we started making a big local impression, and we started building audiences up to about 400 people in St Albans, which was incredible, really. And very soon after that, we had our first recording session, and unbelievably, the first record we had was "She's Not There," which went to #1 in Cashbox. And I just have to quickly say this: many years later, we found out that the guy who not only had turned, certainly me, and I think all of us really, onto rock and roll, Elvis, in 1956, we didn't find this out till 1990, but he had 3 of our songs and songs that I'd written on his jukebox. So
Wow.
that and the thought that 8 years after this creature from outer space I'd seen this magical person which I thought we couldn't approach in a million years. You know, he had our records on his jukebox within 8 years. So that was such a turnaround.
I wonder if I could just say something about our first session when we recorded She's
Sure.
Not There. We arrived at Decca Studios in West Hampstead.
Pretty famous gentleman helped you record that too, right?
He certainly did in the end, but we took the scenic route, but which we did many times in our career, I'm afraid. So we arrived in the evening because it was considered to be more hip to record in the evening and through the night. Nowadays that would never happen, certainly not with us, you know, we'd be asleep by 9 o'clock. So, but we arrived there, and the engineer, who was a very successful engineer, he recorded a lot of hits, but he'd been, unfortunately, because it was a late start, he'd been at a wedding all day, and he was absolutely and completely paralytically drunk. So we walked in, and this guy, not only was he drunk, but he was getting more aggressive by the minute. This is our first time in the studio. Getting more and more aggressive. And we've got the headphones on, and he's screaming obscenities down the headphones. And I thought, and this always makes me laugh, I've been in the business for over 50 years. I've been in the business for 20 minutes, and I thought, this is not for me. This is really not for me. But then we had a bit of luck, and he passed out cold. And we carried him up 3 flights of stairs. There was one zombie on each arm and one zombie on each arm. We put him in a black London taxi, and I never, ever saw him again.
None of us did.
No, but his assistant took over, and his assistant was a guy called Gus Dudgeon, who went on to become one of the most important and famous producers ever, working on many of Elton's albums.
Yeah, and also, it was also his first session as well as ours.
It was his first session, our first session, and he never ever forgot that, and neither did we.
He stayed real friends with us all his life, didn't he?
Yeah. And so She's Not There very nearly wasn't recorded. It was just, if that guy hadn't passed out, I don't think it would have happened. Now we
He's
always
not
try to
there.
get... we should mention a few names that kind of came up too there briefly. You talked a little bit about Jim Rodford. His son, Steve, plays with the band now, right? Plays drums.
Steve was, when we started this second incarnation, it was around about the end of '99, beginning of 2000. And it's because Colin phoned me up and said, why don't we do 6 gigs for fun? And really, that's all we planned to do. And I had to be persuaded to do that. Colin said, look, I've started doing some solo gigs on tour. He said, why don't you come with me for a few gigs? And I said, I don't know if I could go back to all that, because my last memories, just coming off the road with Argent, were these enormous PA systems we had to provide for every gig. Well, to cut a long story short, it would seem that the last thing anyone ever thought about was the hour and a half that we were on stage at night. You know, I mean, everything else around.
We even last bit did quadraphonic sound. Do you remember that rubbish? Yeah.
And I have to say that whoever was mixing our quadraphonic sound didn't really have the hang of it. But that's enough said, really. But anyway, we did these 6 gigs for fun, and I don't know how, but they've turned around. That's turned into 20 years of touring intensely around the world, which is unbelievable.
Well, thank you, because without that, I don't think we would be here now, and the success we've had in these latter years.
Well, we've continued to. Thanks, Hugh. I mean,
But Hugh and I both feel that as well.
Yeah,
you haven't
I
been out
know.
there on the road.
And you said it, and that's lovely. And the thing is that it's a great band, and we record new music all the time, because that's really why we're doing it, to get out there. But Steve Rodford, Hugh's son. Is it Hugh? Is he your son? Sorry, I said I would never admit to that.
Let's look into that.
Yeah. It's Jim's son. Is a great drummer and a lovely guy, and he's been there right from the start of that sort of reincarnated zombie, adventure. And it's been great. And then it was in 2008 that Chris said, who'd been to lots of our gigs actually, And it was always lovely to see him there. But he said, "Do you know what?" He said, "Do you realise it's 40 years since we recorded Odessey and Oracle?" And he said, "The thing I would love to do," he said, "I haven't, you know, played on stage for many years, but the thing I would love to do is, why don't we do it from start to finish?" And
We'd never done it. We never did it before, had we?
We'd never played those songs. With the current incarnation, we played about 5 of them, but some of them needed every overdub, every part that's on the original album to be transcribed and to actually be played to make the songs work. Because we did, for the first time, have more of a multi-track thing when we recorded that. But we didn't think it was going to be successful. We didn't know. But do you know, in the end, I think we only ever had 2 production rehearsals, didn't we? 2 rehearsals with everybody.
That's right, yeah.
So we got Darian Sahanaja from the Brian Wilson band to come over and play the second keyboard parts, and usually the mellotron that I'd overdubbed on the original. And we had the current band doing the extra harmonies that we'd overdubbed on, etc., etc. So every note on the original album was reproduced. And we went off to the first concert. And as we went into the concert hall, the guy who was managing us at the time kept running up and saying, "You'll never guess who I've just seen in the line, you know, to come up for this concert." And after the first couple, you know, he said Robert Plant, and then he said Snow Patrol were in there and everything. And we said, "Stop, you know, we just really don't want to know." Because I thought that this could be the longest night of my life. You know, if we started playing and it didn't work, and we'd only had the 1 full production rehearsal, it was going to be a nightmare. It's something that we'd never get over. But do you know what? After the first 40 seconds of playing, we knew it was going to be great. And it was a magical night, wasn't it?
It was. And the other thing, of course, was Darian Sahanaja said to me when I went to see Brian Wilson, "Could you do, jokingly, can you do with a second keyboard player?" And I said, "To you." And he'd already bought tickets. And then he came over and so Rod said, "Yeah, he's great." So he was the only one who could tell Rod what he's not playing. I mean, if there's a mistake, he would tell Rod what it is. He knows the album inside out, Darian.
He's done every concert with us, and he still buys his own tickets to the shows.
we double the price for it.
So let's think a little bit about, you know, you mentioned recording She's Not There. And then there's this moment where you're in the UK, and then eventually you come over to the United States. And I know all of you guys have talked about that being such an important moment. To come to the US, to play on Murray the K's Christmas show that year, and then eventually you guys ended up on the very first episode ever of Hullabaloo that was filmed as well. So tell us a little bit about some of those experiences, whether it was Murray the K or Hullabaloo, and what that was like really, you know, coming to the US with a hit record, where, you know, the land where Elvis had come from, right? And
Colin, tell me about the dancing.
That is one thought. Is this mic on? Sorry, I don't know.
No.
Okay, I'll just speak loud.
Switch the button. Yeah, switch the button off.
I don't know.
If you take mine, and we'll get
That's not one coming down.
Well, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh dear.
I mean, there's so much to take in that. I mean, one of the main things is because you're American, you wouldn't view American music in the same way as a British musician would. But for us, all great contemporary music comes from America. And so coming over to America in 1964 was incredibly exciting, and it's what every British musician wanted to do. But also it was slightly intimidating because all the musical gods came from America. And we were, by this time, I think we were 18 years old. And so we were coming to a strange country where all our heroes lived. And
we were playing with some of them on the Murray.
We were,
I had to sound check just after them.
I know, on the Murray the K show, there were many wonderful artists. And I remember that we followed in the show, we followed Patti LaBelle, who was sensational. And she brought the house down every night. And then these little skinny 18-year-old kids had to go on stage and follow her. But they were all really, really supportive on that show. Maybe especially so because it was over Christmas, 1964, and everyone was away from home over Christmas, and we had to celebrate backstage.
Was it 8 shows a day, wasn't it? 8 shows a day.
8 shows a day. Mind you, we only had to play 1 or 2 tunes, but we had to be there. But there was great camaraderie backstage, and it was really, really wonderful. And then we went on to the Hullabaloo TV show, and that was fine. It was all plain sailing. I think we only mimed, didn't we? We were only,
Yeah, it was mime.
we were only, you just needed to know the words, really. You just mimed. And then they said, oh, just one little thing. We'd like you all to dance in the middle of the show. I mean, look at us. Look at us.
Do you know who I had? The guy who exploded in the
Action,
Jets.
was it Action?
Action from West Side Story. I thought, my God, you know.
He was kind of partnering
He
you.
was dancing opposite me. Yeah.
Yeah. I hope you didn't show him up. Anyway, to cut a long story short, they had to modify the dance section. We were bloody hopeless. So, on the first Hullabaloo ever, there would have been a longer dance section if it hadn't been for the fact that the zombies were on there.
A little claim to fame for myself on that first of those Murray the K shows. One of the acts on that was the Shangri-Las, who you will remember. And of course they had a huge hit with Leader of the Pack. And those days, long before samples were ever invented, the only way you could get that authentic motorbike sound was by having a real motorbike on stage. And the only person who could get the thing started was me. So I got the job of starting this motorcycle every night for all those shows and revving it at the right point in...
We never saw him again.
Used to go riding around New York.
The thing was, Hugh got the motorbike at the beginning of Leader of the Pack, but then they went on to do Give Me a Great Big Kiss, and Rod got the Great Big Kiss from Mary from Shangri-La. So,
Every night, it was such a trial.
One job, but somebody's got to do it.
On the album you guys did back in 2015, Still Got the Hunger, you wrote a song called New York. That's really kind of about that period of your career.
It was
Coming to you.
completely about that. I mean, that was one. And people often say, "How do you write songs?" And it comes from anywhere, really. You know, it can come from a chord or something you've just heard that triggers something. But that particular one was a rare one. When I was in the car one day, and I was driving with my wife, and the lyrics just came into my mind, and I said, "What do you think of this?" And I, you know, just sang some lyrics, and it turned into being just an exact description of us landing in New York, being a bit overwhelmed, but having great experiences with people like Patti LaBelle, who turned us on to so much music. I have to say, she was the person that introduced us to the music of Aretha, to Nina Simone. They were priceless. I mean, for 18, 19-year-old kids that were in love with music, you know, to have those sort of people talking to you and telling you things was, they were the most magical parts that I remember of that, actually.
Best bit for me was that I could drink and they couldn't.
Still does.
Well, knowing we're a little short on time, of course, I want to take a minute. We have to talk about Odessey and Oracle. I mean, Greg in his introduction was even mentioning, you know, now being referred to back as, you know, one of the great, if not the greatest album and some of the greatest songs of 1969. Really an incredible record that I think continues its legacy to grow. There's so much to hear in that. There's so much going on. We don't have enough time to dig into it. We could probably talk for a whole day just about making that record. But recorded at Abbey Road, I think was Jeff Emmerich and Parsons involved a little bit as well, right?
He was just a tape
Peter
operator.
Vince was...
Alan Parsons was tape op at that time, right?
He once asked me what he's charged from doing production. You know, he was there. And of course, Rod and I, well, none of us were able to go before that time into mix sessions. We got really fed up with that because as writers, we wanted to hear what was going to end up.
We were very disappointed with how our recent records have been mixed, and
So none of you had actually been in the final mixing sessions of records
not till
before
that
that.
point.
Wow.
and we felt that the balls had been taken out of a lot of the and so we were very frustrated. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah, you carry on. And so we got on very well with the publisher, and he said, "Well, we agree with you. Okay, so I've just done a deal with CBS, and they'll give you £1,000, and you've got access to Abbey Road Studios." That meant we had to go
Other
in.
group that wasn't signed to EMI, interjecting, sorry.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right, because
Yeah.
most of the groups that recorded there were signed to EMI, right?
So we had just 3-hour sessions to do, and you usually did 1 or 2 tracks in a 3-hour session. So we had to rehearse very, very well before we went in there. and Rod and I had most of the songs, so basically we just had to rehearse as much as possible before we went in.
The thing was that we knew the songs very, very well because we rehearsed so intensely. The arrangements and the keys were all set. So we were just looking for the performance when we went in there. And we recorded very, very quickly, mostly in Studio 3. The Beatles did record in Studio 3, but they mostly recorded in Studio 2. But they had left a mellotron behind in Studio 3. It was John Lennon's mellotron. And Rod jumped on that, and if you listen to Odessey and Oracle, there's mellotron all the way through that album, so it could have been a very different album if the Beatles hadn't been in just before us. They just finished Sgt. Pepper a couple of days before we went in.
Oh my.
And we inherited John Lennon's mellotron, not full time, just for these sessions.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we could have lifted
Rod, you and I have talked.
It's still at home in my studio.
I was going to say, I think you and I talked about it in New York. I think that's the mellotron John Lennon's that's downstairs.
Yes,
Yeah, I think
Oh.
it is that. Although it's so long ago now that you look at it and think, yeah, I think that was the one.
But it was really exciting to follow the Beatles into the studio, and when we went in there were percussion instruments, tambourines and maracas around on the floor, and we were huge Beatles fans, and we were thinking, my God, Paul McCartney left that time. It was a wonderful feeling, actually. It's a great time to be in Abbey Road. I think it probably was the best studio in the world at that time. So
Absolutely.
we were really fortunate.
What was it like, you mentioned earlier as we were talking, by the time that record hits and really starts to become a success, the Zombies are done at that point?
By far. I
Well
mean,
before that, yeah.
we broke up. We finished that record in '67, and then there was. We had such a low profile in the UK, and in those days you tended to stay where you were from. And we later learned that all over the world we usually had a hit record somewhere, but we didn't know that at the time. So we were pretty badly ripped off anyway from any live things. And we weren't the only band for that to happen to, but it did happen to us. So the only people that had any money were Chris and myself, because we were the writers and we had an honest publisher. And so the writing royalties did come through. But these other guys who should have been really pretty well off, with #1 record here and #1 record there, and big hit records in Australia and Japan, #1s in Japan. But we didn't know any of this, and none of that money was coming through. So we were very badly ripped off. And we thought we loved the album, but for the first time, Chris and I said, "That's how our songs. That's what was in our head." When we wrote them, and they came out that way. But no one was interested in the UK. There was one DJ, a guy called Kenny Everett, who has since become, very beloved actually. But at that time, he got us on his programme and said, "Oh, my lovely Zombies, you've broken up." He said, "Wouldn't it be wise to let the album come out first before you broke up?" But we said, well, we'd already had a single out, and we thought if the single did something, then we'd stay together. But our guitarist was getting married, and he said, "I've got no money." He said, "I've got to move on." We said, "Well, let's just see if this first single hits," but it didn't. Anyway, so we broke up. And then 18
Wasn't the
months...
first single Butcher's Tale?
No,
That was America.
Oh, that was in the US.
It was
later.
Carousel 44 in the UK.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So we broke up. Chris and I immediately, as we've already said, started working on Argent, started working on very quickly with Colin. And 18 months later, those things were well-established paths for us. And as I've said, we were doing the deal with Clive Davis. So that's why we never carried on at that particular point.
And in the US, wasn't it Al Cooper who ended up advocating to get that record put out finally in the US and kind of?
It was Al Cooper, but he wanted two of the records to be. He wanted Carousel. And I don't know if that would have been a hit in the UK or in the US or not, but he also wanted Time of the Season. And along with a lot of the hits that have had over the years, the record company didn't see it at all. They said, because it was a bit off the wall, They said, it's just not like what the other hit records of the time were. So they put it out under protest at the very end, and they just put it out with no real push behind it. And then one guy in Idaho, in Boise, Idaho, there was this DJ that in those days you could play a record and it would start to have a slow influence, and it took 6 months for it to start causing ripples in the pond that was the music business at the time, and it gradually picked up momentum, and then you couldn't stop it, and in the end it went to #1 in Cashbox. I think it was #2 or 3 in Billboard, but it was in Cashbox. I mean, Cashbox at the time, I remember the Beatles talking about Cashbox when their first record went to #1. They said, "We're #1," you know, because it was Cashbox, and that was what they. But you know, Billboard of course have become the Bible, and that's fantastic too.
We should mention too, we'll see if we have 1 or 2 questions from the audience, because I know we're a little tight on time, or if there's any questions from Facebook in a moment, but we should mention the only other original Zombies inducted member who's not here, which is Paul Atkinson. And I wonder if any of you guys have anything to say about Paul at all in his time with the band and the Zombies.
Well, he died in 2004. He was an unusual guitarist, but he was actually, when I wanted to form the band, he was at school with me, but he was in the year below. And I wandered into a classroom looking for a mate at that time, and there was a folk club going on in the corner. And there was this guitarist who just caught my ear because he had such a good groove in what he was playing. It was a folk club that was in the corner, but it had a great sort of groove to what he was playing, and he was the first guy that was asked to be in the Zombies. But he added something, as everybody did in the original lineup. He added something very very distinctive. You know, each player in that original band, we were so lucky because everyone had a really distinctive style, and it all melded together and worked beautifully. And he went on after we finished to have a big career with record companies, and I know Brian Wilson was very fond of him because he'd got some Beach Boys stuff reissued and one thing and another, and he knew he was dying, and in 2004 we did a concert at the House of Blues in Los Angeles, and he said, "My kids have never seen me play," so we got together on stage, and Paul, he was so brave and upbeat and optimistic about everything. He was under a huge drug regime at that time, and he went on stage with a catheter into his arm, and he had, you know, some sort of morphine or something, so he could play. And his kids were blown away. But the thing is that Brian Wilson said to him, "What would you like me to play, Paul?" And Paul said, "I'd like you to play Don't Worry Baby." He said, "Oh, we don't do that." He said, "But I'll rehearse it for you and do it." And he did it for that one performance, you know, which was fantastic.
That's amazing.
Paul was offered a chair and he turned it down and said, "No, I'm standing." And wow.
Bless his heart.
And we'd actually got another guitarist in case Paul couldn't play. And he said, "Why don't you get another bloody guitarist?" He said,
But that was Paul.
That was in 1967. No.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's great. We have a couple questions that came in from the folks out there on Facebook Live who are watching us now. One is David, who was asking, any memories of appearing on television, any favorite appearances or anything that you guys have done over the years?
I remember the first time we did Ready, Steady, Go. It was a live show in London, and this was either our first or our second TV, absolutely live. And they wanted us to do, I presume we did She's Up There as well. But
We did, yeah.
We did Summertime.
Yeah.
So I've got to be honest. Again, I'm maybe just 19 or 18 or something. I was a little nervous to be doing a live TV show, and it's a very important was in London, in England.
And the sound on TV shows in those days was...
Well, it wasn't so bad if you were miming. Which I think we were. But the trick was, they said, I don't know where this came from, they said, "Would you mind getting up this really high ladder?" Now, I really don't like heights, you know, so this is a live TV show. I've got to climb up a great big ladder and sing Summertime. So I was, and there's an audience all milling around, so this ladder kept being knocked. So I went, "Summertime." I remember that. I always remember that TV show.
I've got one other little memory of Ready, Steady, Go that I remember when Colin was talking about it then, because I've always been pretty vague in my life, And I was vaguely walking around the studio and lost my way, as you know, I often used to do then. So I didn't know where I was going. And as I was walking down one of the corridors, I heard the sound of Miles Davis playing from one of the rooms, who I was, you know, in love with that early Miles Davis band of around 58 onwards. And I knocked on the door, and the door opened, and it was Manfred Mann. And he looked at me, and I said, "Oh, sorry to interrupt, but is that Miles playing on that record?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "You're Rod Argent, aren't you?" And I was, you know, I was flattered that he knew I was. So I said, "Yeah." He said, "Oh man," he said, "I love your record, She's Not There." He said, "But you've got to change that name." We never did, and here we are.
Like I said, we don't have too much time. I wonder if there's anyone in the audience who has a question. Gretchen has a mic. She's going to bring it down so we can hear it, and also the folks on the stream. Right here in the center, if we can pass it over. Gretchen. Thank you.
In one of the John Lennon biographies, it's mentioned that he expressed interest in becoming a manager of the Zombies. Did he ever talk to any of you about that?
We heard it by someone else said that he expressed he would like to produce us, not manage us. But we never spoke to him personally about it, but we heard from authoritative people.
Gretchen, let's get the gentleman up in the front, have his hand up here too.
Obviously now the music industry has changed from the time you guys were 18-year-olds. If you were starting over today, what would you do differently to make it today versus what you did back then to make it?
Well, I think that the main thing we could possibly look at, I mean, the thing is, to tell you the truth, we're all really happy with where we are now. And we wouldn't be here if we hadn't made all those mistakes. So, I mean, I often think about that. If only we hadn't done this, if only we hadn't done that. But then we wouldn't be here now. But putting that to one side, I mean, I would be very interested to look at the business side of what happened, not just to the Zombies, but most bands in the 60s. And our manager, man, he was merciless. He took every cent, you know. And I just wish that we'd have been a little wiser. I can remember saying to the band, I don't know if they remember, but I was saying, you know, this isn't right. We're just playing every night. We're only 18 and 19, we're exhausted, and we're making no money. And they said to me, well, you tell us what's going wrong, and we'll try and put it right. And I couldn't say. But one of the main things was, so if anybody's in a band and you're looking up, you know, you're worried about the business side of it, look out for people double selling. Because it's really simple. There's just two contracts. So the manager stroke agent will sell the band to a promoter for $1,000, and he'll tell them...
That bears on Odessey and Oracle, because we actually would be telling this story, but our manager, we had no work in the UK, and he said, I've got 10 days for you in the Philippines for £100 between you.
80.
Yeah, but he took 20%, so there was £80. And we arrived to find that we were playing in the second biggest Astrodome in the world, which was the Araneta Coliseum, to 30,000 people a night. I made
For 10
their losses.
nights.
Yeah.
We got 80 quid a night.
Yeah.
So you can see that something was wrong. But getting back to that double selling, it's just really, really simple. Is you just have two contracts, and you sell one, say, as $1,000 to the promoter, so the agent stroke manager will get $1,000, and then he gives a contract to the band for $100.
Yeah.
And then he takes, in that case, it was 30% of what we got. So that was the main way it was done. It's so simple.
I mean,
Somewhere floating about, there's a few million quid that we're owed.
Right.
I'd like to have
But
it.
beware of that
I mean, the
bad
thing is,
figure.
what Colin's saying is absolutely true. But it wasn't that we weren't aware of the ripping off that was going on in the industry. When we turned professional, we tried to do everything we could to vet the management companies. And in the end, we chose wrongly. But what were we to know? You know, I mean, the thing is, we chose a particular management company, and they did rip us off badly, but I don't know, we were aware that might happen.
I know, well, I remember we spoke to 3 management companies, and bet you anything the other two companies would have done exactly the same. So it wasn't like we chose the wrong guy.
Someone from
Every
the
other
same organisation said not long ago he was at a dinner with Chris, and Chris didn't approach this subject at all. But the guy suddenly turned to Chris and said, you know, all that zombie stuff in the early days, that was nothing to do with me, you know. And Chris said, oh, okay, you know, we weren't talking about that at all. But he said, but if we hadn't have ripped you off, somebody would have done.
Can you believe it? Oh my God.
And it was £2 million. He admitted to
That's in
us
those
in the
days.
60s
Shame.
being ripped off to the tune of £2 million. But as Colin said when he first started talking, who knows if we'd be there then? I had a very good friend who was asked to join the Beatles even before Ringo, when he was playing with Joe Brown, this particular guy, a guy called Bobby Graham. And he thought it was in the bigger band, which was Joe Brown at the time, so he said no. But he said, listen, he said, if I'd have been in the Beatles, I would have killed myself within 10 years, you know, with everything that was out there, with drugs, with, you know, whatever, because he had that sort of personality. So you can never, you know, you can never regret in a way, because, you know, we've had happy lives, basically.
What is meant to be is really meant to be, isn't it?
And the lucky thing is we still like each other. It's very rare for 60 bands.
I'll even say to that, it's a great thing to have you and Chris out here today because, again, not touring all the time with the regular band, and you guys are coming out to do the gig today, and how great to have you and Chris come for the interview,
been a
the
pleasure.
dedication, and I think you're going to join outside for a little bit later today as well, too. So,
We surely are.
one last question, and I know the answer already, but I think it's a good one to end on. From Facebook, Dorothy wants to know, any chance of a new Zombies album, of new Zombies music coming up soon?
Yeah. I mean, the last album we had out was about 3 years ago, was it?
Yeah.
And it actually charted in the top 100 album sales. And we had a phone call from Billboard while we were on the road to tell us that. And that gives us so much of a buzz. It really, really does. We've just started working on a new one. And Colin and I were talking about this last night, and the fantastic thing that I love is that we go out on stage and we have a ball playing things like Time the Season and She's Not There and everything else. We don't get tired of that. We have a ball doing that. But it knocks us out that when we play new material, like from the last album, we do 2 or 3 songs from the last album, they go down great. And then last night, or the night before last, when we played our first gig on this tour, and we're still jet lagged now, but I can't tell you how jet lagged we were on that night. And we dared, you know, to play this new song, and it wasn't perfect on stage. It always takes a few days to sink these things in, but it went down the storm, you know. So
It's really funny, when you do a new song, I completely missed all the lyrics. It was a disaster for me, but no one knew.
Might we hear that this afternoon too?
well, you might do. We'll see how we go.
All right, good.
Oh, go on, play it.
All right, a few things before we wrap up here, just to let you know, we are doing the dedication down on the Hall of Fame floor. All of you who are in here, thank you for being our VIP ticket purchasers. You are invited to come down. I'm going to ask one favor as we wrap up. Let's let the guys get out so we can get downstairs and get set up, and then we'll open up the theater for all of you to come down and join us on level 3, the Hall of Fame floor, where we'll actually get to see the plaque and your names inscribed right there on the Hall of Fame floor, along with Elvis and all the other greats we talked about today. So, ladies and gentlemen, just please stay in your seat, but one more time, let's thank, and we're so excited to see this play later,